Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in. I do have a presentation for you all today, and it's downloadable from the program. And so this is the title of my talk. And I also just want to say, Marietta, that was a powerful presentation, and I am very appreciative to come after your talk and to absorb all the things that you were saying. I actually put one of my slides back in after listening to you. Um, okay, so my talk is called Envisioning the Future. Imagine a world that includes the baby's experience. And like Nisha said, I'm a somatic practitioner. I'm in private practice. I have run large educational programs and small educational programs. I was a maternal child health specialist that traveled throughout the world, mostly Africa, before I became a therapist. And I've been doing this for almost actually 24 years now. And so this is more about me, and you can find more about me at ppncenter.com. But what I want to focus on is this idea of crafting a new future. So what would it take to support peace and better health outcomes? I want to talk about some recent trends, and I'm going to go at a pace I know for our translators, and also I can talk about these trends for a long time, and I feel like the presentations today and also over the course of the past 4 days have all spoken to these trends. The high degree of infant maternal mortality and morbidity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that this morning. Actually, it's morning where I am at. But in terms of maternal infant mortality, like more than 1,000 women die every day of complications around childbirth. That's one person dying every 90 seconds. In our country, we have a huge problem with the opioid abuse, and nearly 92,000 persons in the U.S. died from drug-involved overdoses in 2020. So we have a question that we ask around addictions. It's not so much why the addiction, but why the pain? And my presentation today will talk about that. We're looking also at birth trauma, which I am in complete agreement with Marietta about this. Like, birth trauma rates are 1 in 3, but the pandemic sometimes has increased to about 45%, so almost 1 in 2. And then when we're talking about perinatal mood disorders and parental leave, I have some information about that today as well. But when I first started teaching, it was 1 in 20 reported these types of perinatal mood issues. Now it is between 15 and 20%, so 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, 1 in 5. And worldwide, WHO reports that about 10% of pregnant women and 13% of women who have just given birth experience what they call a mental disorder. But what we're looking at are epidemics of what I've seen so much evidence of in this conference of obstetrical violence and trauma, lack of places where people can recover from these things adequately, lack of support for our staff as well. So we're looking at wanting to change a whole system. In our country, we have a huge problem with racial disparity, which I haven't seen a lot of discussion about in this conference, but I haven't been able to be in every corner. But in our country, we now know that if you are a Black American or a person of color, you are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth and 2 to 3 times as likely to have a low birth weight baby. We have huge epidemic also of domestic violence. This has gone up from the pandemic, because families were more isolated with lack of resources. But each year, approximately 1.5 million women in the United States report some form of sexual or physical abuse. When we're looking at also this Me Too campaign, raised awareness about these types of experiences in women and in some in men. And of course, we have this global pandemic, which I tried to keep track of the numbers for this presentation, with over 6.5 million deaths around the world, and with 1 million deaths in the US, leaving loss, especially for children. And so, like I am putting a heaping of other recent trends upon this recent trend: the invasion of Ukraine, the energy and climate crisis, starvation in food deserts, poverty, and the refugee migration. So I think we can all agree that our world is not in good condition. And I so appreciated the research of Sue Carter, who talked about how vasopressin without oxytocin creates this sort of aggressive culture. And seeing the increase in these mass shootings and all the mass violence, especially in our country, I would say we need a dose of oxytocin. So how are we going to do that? So let's plan a world that includes the baby's experience. So this is the research of Daniel Weinberger, who said that really every gene in our body is influenced by birth. And this was the first time I'd heard this, was at a conference in 2019 on the fetal brain. So all of our genes are impacted by what happens at birth. And many of our neurodevelopmental trajectories, the patterns are laid down, even with epigenetics, but also, what happens in the womb. So I want to lay out some statistics for you just to set the stage for the second part of my presentation, which will hopefully be the antidote. So we've heard a lot about birth trauma at the conference, and I so appreciated the previous presentation because this is where I also have found like many shades of gray. Of course, we can agree that there are major threats, life-death feelings that can happen at births, but it's not just about the statistics of these really high stakes interventions. It's the feeling of feeling invaded, the feeling of loss of dignity or control, the feeling of not being supported, not being given that informed consent, just like we heard in the previous speaker. And even though we will associate many of the birth traumas to these medical interventions or the over-medicalization of birth, what I have overwhelmingly found is that it's the relationships with the providers that also are damaging. These are some of the statistics that I have, and I have a very long bibliography or references at the end of my presentation for you. You can download the presentation from the this whole conference website. But we're trying to decide like what is it that we're seeing and how do we treat it, and giving it the label of post-traumatic stress. One presentation I heard recently talked about PTSD as somatic time travel. And when I'm attending to families, this is my job mostly. I work with families that have had birth trauma. If the woman or the partner, the parent, the father, they are very much impacted by this vulnerable threshold moment. Like if it's not well received, if it's not supported, then the baby also suffers. So we're looking at higher rates of PTS in our families. The pandemic has made this harder. This is a study that looked at the increased rates of postpartum depression and PTS in families. Mostly they found that the insecure attachment, which is another developmental form of trauma, predisposed many of our families to this type of response to the isolation that they feel during, and the fear that they feel during the pandemic. Here is another slide about a study that it covered, excuse me, many different kinds of countries, but over almost 7,000 women. And you can see here that the rates of PTS are way up, over 40%, with high rates of anxiety and depression as well for our mental health outcomes. Some other considerations have to do again with those shades of gray. And even though medical trauma can be perceived of as assault or these medical interventions, it's the relational field with our birthing families where trauma can arise. All forms of emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect, exploitation that results in actual or potential harm to the child's health, development, or dignity. So this is the layers of experience in our families. So we're looking at an adult population in our country that has already experienced levels of trauma. And so our providers need to become more aware. How can we support families better for those coming to seek during childbirth? Our maternal mortality rates in our country are embarrassingly high. Our disparities also embarrassingly high and getting worse. So this is the latest study I could find in the Center of Disease Control in our country. The maroon dark here is 2020. The green is 2019. The blue is 2018. And these are the rates of maternal mortality by ethnic group. And these are a non-Hispanic Black population. You can see how our country is just there, that things are getting worse even for every ethnic group, but most especially for our people of color. Just a few more statistics. I want to talk about morbidity because it's one thing to talk about mortality. It's another thing to talk about how people are hurt, which is morbidity. And there are organizations in our country that track, like for every woman who dies in childbirth, up to 70 nearly die. So some places, see that as 50,000 women who suffer. Others have put that number as high as 80,000. So these are wounded families. And most likely the child is very also wounded in this, whether or not actually they have physical wounds. It's a whole, holding the whole is what we need to do. Many of the things that happen for morbidity, we can see a huge increase in our country. Many can be prevented. And what these journalistic stories or exposés, or investigative reporting has seen and shown is that we have a culture here of what they call denial and delay. We don't pay enough attention. We're not paying enough attention. So the patterns that we're tracking in childbirth, these are the list of birth patterns and birthing parents and babies that I've worked with that are very challenging. I like the idea of really helping families get that informed consent about what might happen at childbirth. But many families don't listen. They say, "Oh, I didn't think it was going to be me." And when I talk to the fetal brain researchers, they have actually gone very deeply into understanding the impacts of birth on people. Mostly they are studying the emergence of what they call heavy mental illness and other disorders, metabolic disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders in adults. And this is a study that came in the 1994. I have the study listed in our references that divided up all the things that can happen prenatally and during birth. And they gave it a number. This is just the highest, more severe morbidity that can happen during childbirth. And this presentation was made in my online school by one of the fetal brain researchers. But it just gives you a flavor of how can we begin to flag what happens for people. COVID, like I said, has made it a lot worse. Mostly it's the fear and the isolation that the families have experienced, and in the postpartum period as well. And for babies, this is where I would like to begin to shift to talk about babies and then give you a little bit of an antidote to some of the severe data. But I know that I track our country. One of the things that bothers me the most is that our country is so powerful. We're a superpower, and we spend 3 times as much on our medical care than many of the other OECD countries. So why are we ranked so low in our health of our people? We have a challenge in our country. It doesn't. If we were some kind of health determinant Olympics, we wouldn't be gaining the gold medal. And so I like to look at that, examine that. What is going on? Money and power does not translate into health. So we're looking at these high rates of prematurity, high rates of low birth weight, which is we have the worst of the high resource nations. And again, the high rate of prematurity amongst African American populations. This is one of the more later statistics that I could find on mortality rate by ethnicity amongst babies. You can see that for Black babies, they're so much higher than other ethnic groups in our country. And we're one of the highest countries, high resource countries for prematurity. 1 in 10 of us in the United States is premature. And when we're looking at, well, how does this translate into health problems? We're looking at, this is the things that I treat in my office. Breathing problems, feeding difficulties, oxygen deprivation, developmental delays, vision problems, hearing problems, other morbidity, difficulty breastfeeding, difficulty sleeping. We see a huge range of increase of tongue-tie and intrauterine constraint here, issues with cranial nerves, and there just aren't enough baby body workers or therapists to help. Finally, this is the information on mental health issues in our country, with there to be an increase for women reporting having perinatal mood and anxiety issues, increases in anxiety, increases both antenatally and postpartum, with 1/3 of women reporting depressive symptoms at 4 years following birth, and many of their partners also. A recent study out of an organization called the Commonwealth Fund painted a picture of how much this costs for our country. And you can see in total dollars of maternal morbidity in the millions of dollars, $32 billion is the price tag. So I am painting the picture for a need for change. It's not like we haven't known that. And I know from attending to families that there are human vectors for trauma, and they all are in the professionals that attend to our families. So I feel a real calling to help and make this change and to work with professionals, to give them the trauma-informed skills, to actually listen to them as well, and to create environments for their learning and for their own nervous systems, because everything is connected and needs a change. So I'm going to stop here and reshare because I have a video I want to show you from David Chamberlain.
In other words, I'm seeing that the beginning is a necessary foundation for how it ends. And I think we're very delusional about civilization, just like we've been about circumcision. And it's the same delusion. If we torture babies, where do we get off thinking they're going to turn into wonderful, peaceful, loving citizens? This is crazy thinking. If we disturb the relationship of mothers and babies at birth, then how do we think we're going to have wonderful relationships between mothers and babies of harmony and deep bonding and respect and honor coming out of that when it's been trashed in the birth process? I think we're kidding ourselves that we can ruin birth, fail at birth, and still pick up our reward in civilization. It's not going to be there. I think when we brutalize babies, we plant the seeds of destruction of our civilization in them. And they don't know any better. They just act it out. Someone once said, as we treat the babies will treat the world. And this is a great truth. We're kidding ourselves that if we just wish for civilization, it's not going to come to pass.
So I'm going to go into the second part of my presentation with this quote. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better, by Maya Angelou. And I feel like this conference has been filled with information about how we can do it better. And so the antidote is planning this world that includes the baby's experience. So let's imagine a world where parents and babies thrive. There are good birth outcomes. Birth is more satisfying, less stressful. Birth trauma is greatly decreased, or at least it's treated right away. We don't have to wait. We don't have to ignore. We can just have the tools that we need right at our fingertips, so that their stress is managed and there's greater enjoyment of life. There are better connected relationships between all people, where families are happy and feel more support. They don't live their lives in isolation. And then African American mothers, babies, and people have more equal treatment and better outcomes. So we begin at the beginning, laying down the roots of health. So again, imagining that we are a tree, and in our metaphor of the tree, the ground, the roots, these are the birth, conception, preconception, prenatal time, birth, and our ancestral experiences. I know we all each have long lives, so I know it doesn't define all of us. But just if we are going to imagine a new world, let's just intervene here. I know I'm talking to the choir here, but just consider that as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And just here are our perinatal roots. These are all the things that we do in the pre and perinatal somatic trainings and understandings and helping. And these are all things I've seen the presentations here talk about. I know we can make this change because we know now a lot about what happens transgenerationally that comes from the ancestors. We know a lot about the early childhood too. And now we know a lot about the baby's experience as well. We have everything we need. So the womb is a school and every baby attends. We can start with how parenting begins before birth. This is the work of Catherine Monk. She has created a lab at the University of Columbia in New York City, and they've started publishing scientific papers on how If we can support families, and this is nothing new to this audience, I mean, I've seen some really amazing presentations on prenatal bonding and connecting to babies. I'm still thinking about Rita's presentation yesterday, and I know that there's a lot of ways we can support our families. What she found was that if a mother was anxious in pregnancy, that the child was 2 times as likely to have anxiety or ADHD. So we know we need to go even before pregnancy. We need to go into our populations and give them tools. I've seen presentations at this conference that talk about all this research on how babies learn language in utero. They learn so much. They learn about their own felt sense of safety. They're so super sentient, super prescient. They can respond to love and attention from the womb, and that our life is relational from the very start. That we can now be able to implement stress management in pregnancy. I mean, this is when I first started teaching and all the things I've done, this wasn't as prevalent as it is now. I think many of you who are out there in the audience know that now, we have other tools. We know about adverse childhood experiences. We can work with our parents to self-confront and understand their own nervous systems. A lot still needs to be done around the social determinants of health. And these are all the things that, Olga, I heard you talk so passionately about. How can we make change happen in some of the more impoverished areas of our world? But we can support now how health begins in the womb. Health crosses generations, as does trauma. And if we bring our attention to supporting maternity care, respectful maternity care, we can change these birth outcomes, and we can maybe change the way we're interacting in our world. Looking again at the research around what happens for babies. This is a world that includes the baby's experiences. We know that if we can support our women and girls, the primary period, having a mom feel safe in her body while she's carrying a baby will very much influence how that baby feels. Memories get laid down in the womb. All their implicit and procedural memories happen on the inside. Our neurons are being developed at a very high rate. All the scaffolding also can be flavored by what the mother experiences. All of our learning happens in the womb. Well, not all of our learning, but some important learning. So looking for best practices, we can start to incorporate prenatal bonding. And from the latest research from Gerhard Schroth, prenatal bonding also can help facilitate breastfeeding and decrease the amount of postpartum depression. You can see in this slide, this is from Gerhard, breastfeeding at 6 months was much higher here than that they didn't have any prenatal bonding. And we know that when looking at the development of peaceful cultures, this is the work of understanding the roots of violence. Breastfeeding plays a huge role in the development of peaceful cultures. And then looking at how we have a decrease in the amount of postpartum depression here. And here, you can just see the rates are much lower in babies and families that have had prenatal bonding. And then integrating more midwifery care. The beautiful presentations I've seen here on midwifery, especially from our southern countries, Latin American countries. I mean, I'm very encouraged, and I feel like our country could use a lot more support of the midwifery model, understanding that this type of care has great health outcomes for everyone. This is a research study that came out of the University of the British of Columbia that showed how families experience better outcomes when midwives practice to their full capacity and are a part of the system. And then in marginalized communities in the US, where the health system is often stretched thin, expanding access to midwives and increasing their responsibility could be a feasible strategy for improving maternity care. So within our country, only 10% of U.S. births involve midwives. There are much greater outcomes, positive outcomes with midwives, higher rates of vaginal births and breastfeeding. And there are poorer outcomes, mostly high rates of C-section, premature births, low birth weight, and newborn deaths. The research on keeping women company in labor has been proven with a variety of increased outcomes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, even to the point of seeing that large percentages in decrease in C-section rates and other types of interventions. So we're looking at a system that we know we can make changes in. And then really work with families to create a postpartum plan. I know birth plan is a very big strategy, big word that's used in many places, but we've been focusing more in my realm of influence on helping families develop a postpartum plan, where they can make sure that they have those layers of support, integration for any trauma, lactation if needed, and also working with parental leave from work. This is where I think our country really fails our families. We have a saying in our country that's coined by Mary Jackson when she worked with Ray Castellino, is that we deserve 2 layers of support. Every baby deserves 2 layers of support. And she found that when she got adequate support herself as a midwife, she had a string of births that didn't transfer to hospital. And what that means is for many home birth midwives, especially in our region, at least 20% of home births will transfer to hospital. But she had a whole year where births didn't transfer, especially when she got enough support. So I think that's another key to success in envisioning a world that is better, providing more support for our staff. And then here I wanted to really highlight how parental maternity leave can really make a great change in cultures, even in birthing cultures. In our country, we don't have any maternal leave that's mandated. I know within some federal governments, they've been given now 12 weeks, but we're not required by law to provide paid maternity leave benefits. So this was the latest data I could find. It looks at paid maternity leave across the world, and you can again see that United States is at 0, and that there are other countries that do such a better job. And I think that this is where I really wish we could make a bigger difference for our families, because many women go back to work within 2 to 6 weeks after they have a baby. And then many of the women work their whole time. So we need better care for families. And so it's just becomes a pattern that feeds on itself. Children feel abandoned, neglected, women feel overworked, and there just isn't enough support. So for me, the solution has a lot to do with creating a trauma-informed care model. And to practice trauma-informed care, clinicians must realize the importance of trauma and recognize their signs, respond to them therapeutically, and resist re-traumatization. So this is my new model of care. This is what I'm promoting and training practitioners in my programs, that working to help understand trauma that starts preconception. This is my logo, the baby in the tree, imagining that we are like trees and we grow toward the light. We always have our own strategies, our adaptation sequences that we go through to survive, but on the inside is always still the baby. So really helping families understand the baby's experience, then addressing baby and birth trauma immediately, working to prevent it with understanding of prenatal bonding and connection and stress management for the family, working to include the adults, all, not just parents, but providers as well, understanding layers of trauma that can happen for the adults that are helping around this very vital threshold moment as we increase our families and, you know, create new humans. And we're always sort of addressing all the layers of trauma, but most especially the baby, which can speak so very loudly in adults around birth. So it just creates, it's an opportunity for more education. Okay, so thank you. And here are my references. Feel free to download and explore.
Wow.